Welcome, everyone, to the Livestock Podcast. I'm your host, Kurtis Reed. Thank you for tuning in and subscribing as we're pushing forward with the idea of interviewing members within our livestock industry in Canada that have great stories, a passion for the business, and that mentorship to pass along to all of us listening that want to better ourselves. Over the past few days, I've had a few questions about episode launch. When are you dropping? How can I listen to you on Apple iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, whatever your favorite podcatcher is? So currently, our plan is to drop our episodes on the third Monday of each month. And if we have second bonus episodes, they would drop on the first Friday of the month. So something just to watch for there as we're going forward and really trying to push towards getting that 10 to 12 spot. The second question I've been receiving on some DMs from our social networks, and you can find us out there at Lifestockpod, Lifestockpod. So find us on all of your favorite social networks, send us a DM, and one DM that I've received before we've even launched an episode was, where did you get the name Livestock from? And it's something to me that was all encompassing to what I do. My life is embedded in agriculture. I work in the agriculture business as a account sales representative. I manage several other businesses under our farm umbrella and what we're trying to do and promote. And it's a industry, and we talk about commercial cattle, purebred cattle, the show ring, something that has had such a influence on me, allowed myself to see the wonderful parts of our country and also go out of country for some really big time life experiences. So that's why I called it Livestock. My world revolves around livestock, not just cattle. That opens it up to all different types of livestock. And that's really where the name came about. So with that, before we get into our interview with a man that I feel has wonderful stories, great potential, has been in the business for so long, and also has outside of the livestock business experience, which I think will be invaluable as we get to it, we're going to get into our leadoff segment called Goin' Showin'. And this is sponsored by the Cliffs Farm. And again, a little tongue-in-cheek because my family is the Cliffs Farm. We don't currently have any sponsors on the podcast. This is a time where feel free to jot it down again on all of our social channels at Livestock Pod. Feel free to send us a message if you'd be interested in coming on and working with our team and putting your name out there a bit. But Goin' Showing is just about getting the current and upcoming cattle shows out there for everyone to listen to. So to begin with, the Calgary Stampede Junior Steer Classic has announced they will be showing on July 11th in Olds, Alberta at the Cow Palace in conjunction with the Summer Synergy. So please make sure you're online looking up rules and information to get registered. Our next show is the Canadian Junior Shorthorn Show, July 9th through the 11th in Lacombe, Alberta. Another one will be the Summer Synergy itself. Not just one show, but really all encompassing of many different shows, lots of ties, some major industry events happening around that time. That will be from the 12th to 16th of July, and also include the Canadian Charolais Youth Association National Show. The Alberta Junior Hereford Association will be hosting their junior show / field day in Hardisty at the Rutledge Family Ranch from July 16th to the 18th. Alberta Young Canadian Semitole Association will be hosting their summer show July 29th through August 1st in Stettler, Alberta. And our final announcement will be the Junior Stockman Show September 25th, held in Swift Current, Saskatchewan. So now that our announcements are out of the way, my vivid memories that come to me when I think about David Hasson and Gold Bar Livestock as a younger person getting out into agribushing, having the opportunity to go and work for others and walk around the barns, take in all the sights. I vividly remember just how those Gold Bar strings were presented, the professionalism, how well they were clipped. That's something when I was a kid, I would walk around and watch people just clip. Maybe I weirded out some people standing at the foot of their stall, but something I was so enamored by was getting better at clipping, and that was a place that I loved to go watch. As they prepared, really the most vivid of those times was in one of the last few Red Angus strings that Gold Bar brought out to agribition, and they had that tube style air vent. You know, it like shot the air down on the cattle instead of just a direct fan, and something that was extremely unique and only, it was like that individualized thing. When you saw those tubes, you're like, oh, there's Gold Bar string, I have to go look. So something I remember, as a kid. So to begin with, and I've been told this several times just as we've been chatting off air here, to bring in Mr. Hasson, who every time I say that, he says he's going to remind me that I'm Mr. Reed. And, I like to be called Kurtis, and he likes to be called Dave. So, Dave Hasson, thank you very much for coming on the podcast with me to have a little bit of a conversation about your past and where you've been, some experiences and stories.
Kurtis, great to be with you.
So, for myself, I've looked into the past of Gold Bar a little bit, made a few phone calls, but for those listening on the podcast here, from your beginnings, where did you start out in terms of your operation?
Well, gosh, you touched on it earlier. It started out several years ago. I'm not as young as I used to be. Anyway, my first experience was basically in 4-H. I can think of just before that time period, my dad had dual-purpose milking shorthorns. And my job was to go along after the milking machines had been taking off and strip out or get out the remaining milk from these cows so they didn't get mastitis. And these dual-purpose milking shorthorns way back when had big bulbous teats. It made an everlasting impression on me because I just learned to hate those when you had to get two hands around a teat to get the last remaining parts of milk out.
Mm-hmm. And every now and then having a cow that didn't appreciate that you were trying to keep her healthy, I imagine.
No, they didn't like that at all. My dad's had some back issues and eventually had to sell the milking cows. And we started into raising purebred Angus cattle. His herd name was Chicory Lane Farms. So while he was doing that and I was finishing high school and university, I decided I wanted to be a veterinarian. As I got closer and closer to actually being in the schooling program to be a veterinarian, I finally realized that I'd really rather work on my own cattle than somebody else's. So I left university and started a fitting service, which was the first of its kind in Canada, where we really spent time preparing cattle for shows and sales for other people.
Well, that's super interesting.
It was back in a time frame when exotic cattle were being imported en masse into Canada. It was an interesting time for me because Charolais had already been in the country for a few years. And I was asked by a lot of people to travel to France, Switzerland, Austria to select cattle to bring to Canada of just about every exotic breed that came to Canada. Those people were generally, the owners were not necessarily great cattle people. They were contained a large segment of investment people. So because of their reduced skills with cattle, there was a lot of need for a fitting service.
But it was well beyond a fitting service. Right. That turns
Sorry?
into so much about consultation and marketing and management that you had started a fitting service that really became all encompassing.
Indeed, it was. It led itself. I spent a lot of time at basically marketing period
Mm-hmm.
and advising some of the owners on, what to breed these animals to, when to sell them, et cetera, et cetera. In that time frame, obviously, I bought some cattle myself, and I had a partner in a venture. His nickname was Barney, and my nickname was Goldie from having called the firm Golden Fitting Service.
Okay.
Hence the name Gold Bar Livestock was born.
That's a good, the mashup, right? You always wonder where names come from. I like that.
Yeah, so it had nothing to do with the value of the ore itself. It was just two guys' nicknames hooked together. So in 1975, I bought the first farm a couple miles away from my mom and dad's farm. And we decided at the time to hook up together. We carried forward the name Gold Bar Livestock. And I sold off all of the exotic cattle that I had and sold my dad's Angus cattle. And we started producing a polled Hereford herd. It was kind of a unique arrangement. My dad was pretty good with cattle, but he was also really, really good with the land. So his role in Gold Bar Livestock was to maintain the land, do the fencing, produce the feed, et cetera. And mine was more in the genetic composition of our herd, marketing it, selling it, et cetera, and showing to the public. And my mom at the same time she became our bookkeeper, and my wife, Angela, became I call her the social director, because we had a lot of people coming and going in those years.
Right. So what year would you have started the Gold Bar Polled Hereford herd?
In 1975. That was our starting year. As I said, as we sold off other breeds,
Mm-hmm.
We added polled Herefords. So I did a lot of travel, this primarily in Ontario and Western Canada, to find a genetic base to start with. So that was a really interesting time, because you got to, of course, meet a number of people that you had never ever met before, but you had maybe seen some of their cattle at events, et cetera, or somebody had told you that, a breeder in Saskatchewan where Alberta, for example, had some good cattle, so you would just go and check them out yourself.
Oh,
So
that's
how we
interesting. As a
started.
Hereford breeder myself, when I think back to 1975, I think about the polled cattle really starting to come into their own.
Yeah, it was an interesting time, because the polled cattle, frankly, I remember not being nearly as good as the horn cattle in 1975 through to about maybe 1980, early 80s. But through selection and mating, they quickly gained on the horn cattle. Eventually, in the show ring where they were compared, really started to excel.
Mm-hmm.
But initially, the horn cattle had quite a bit more bone to them and more muscle in them, et cetera, than the polled cattle did. And as the frame became more of an issue to get the cattle bigger, the polled breeders were the first ones to kind of adopt that. And that was fought a little bit, would be the best words I could use, by the horn breeders. So the polled cattle got a little more frame in them, and then we started breeding a little bit more muscle to them, et cetera, as time went along.
Mm-hmm.
So they became a very useful breed. As I called them, they were one of the grass breeds.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, polled Herefords and Angus were equipped, more bodily equipped, to convert grass to protein, where a lot of the continental cattle at that particular time were more, I call them grain cattle, where they really needed grain to produce protein. We kept thinking that over time that wouldn't sustain itself because grain would be used more and more to sustain people. So the use of being able to convert grass to protein would become more and more important. And in fairness to the continental breeds, that's exactly what they've done over the years is changed them, bred them so that they have the ability to convert more grass to protein like the British breeds do.
It's amazing the transformation of those continental cattle from those pictures from before I was walking around on two legs, but even to today and being in the business now myself for quite a while, just watching how they developed. And now every breed is just so good themselves. How, in my opinion, how they've been selected, what they look like, still balancing muscle volume with, overall doability and look.
No, you're absolutely right. The very first animals that we took to agribition were actually market steers. That would be for about the first 2 years. And then we had still some Charolais cattle that I had in my herd. We had champion bull with two different bulls 2 years in a row at agribition. And if you look back, that was probably about 73, 74. But look back at the pictures of those two bulls right now, you didn't have to duck a lot if you wanted to run underneath them.
There was a lot of daylight coming through?
Yeah. Now, in fairness, there was a lot of daylight.
Yeah.
B, the hair was all shaved off underneath them.
Right.
And C, the photographer was way down in a crouch looking up at them, picturing them to make them look more that way.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny how times have changed in that area. I'm kind of rambling here a little bit. In 1966, I won the Queen Skinnies, which is a market youth livestock steer show, the biggest one at that point in Canada. There was about 464 entries, I think, that year. And the photographer never ever pictured the steer out in the ring. They were only pictured in a pen where straw was up to their bellies. And the photographer stood up on top of one of the bleachers near the pens and shot down into a pen showing the steer and a number of people. So you can imagine that they looked really small, and they were pretty small because I think the steer at that point was totally finished and weighed 810 pounds.
Almost in the back half of that era that they called belt buckle cattle.
Yeah, it was very much in the tail end of that. My younger sister won the same competition 4 years later. Her steer was very controversial at the time, I can remember, because it was really too big. It weighed 925 pounds. So it's pretty hard to imagine that now, but too big. It was 925 pounds in those days.
Right. The first one and the start of that next trend.
Right.
Yeah.
So there were polled Hereford sales, actually, one in Saskatoon for a number of years called the 5+ sale. They were promoting bigger cattle, and the 5+ number came from they had to have a frame score of 5 or more to be eligible to get into the sale.
Mm-hmm.
And that one was conceived and managed by a friend of mine named Ted Sorenko of T-Bar C Cattle Company, a sales management firm out of Saskatoon. So going back, Kurtis, our first animals pulled Hereford as we started to show. I can remember the very first one. I showed at the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto in a yearling class of females of 33.
33.
I was standing 33rd in the class, and a friend of mine, Bill Edelstein from Hayes Farms Exports, came out into the ring as the judge was waiting for his turn with the microphone, and they hadn't handed out any ribbons or anything yet. Knew it was my first showing of polled Herefords and congratulated me on winning the class. I had to point out to him after I realized that he was not joking with me, that really this animal was last, not first. The funny part was about this story is that the next year I took the same female back to exactly the same show with a calf at side, and that was pretty rare in those days for these heifers to have a baby at 2.
Right.
A lot of them were held over to calve at 3-year-olds. Again, totally different from today's production. Anyway, the following year, she was champion female. So
Yeah, that just goes to show you year to year, right?
Yeah, it's quite a change. The funny thing was that the guy who handed out the trophy and was telling me how much he really liked the heifer when she was champion, he was actually the judge that put her 33rd in class out of 33. I never had the heart to say anything to him, because he was quite a kind and gentleman.
Yeah, that's a good story.
So that was my first showing of a polled Hereford. We did a little bit better than that over the years.
I'm quite similar to you. In the first show that I had taken a Hereford heifer to, I also stood down closer to the bottom. Not quite a class of 33. I think it was a class of 6 at a Manitoba milk run show when I was just starting out. But those times when you're at the bottom, it if you take it the right way, if you look at it as an opportunity, that was a big kind of kick to the rear end to really put yourself in a better position the next year with what you had available.
Yeah, obviously there's a learning curve, and for the listeners, I think that over the years when I've judged a lot of shows, and of course shown at a lot of them, the biggest obstacle for people to make progress with their own herds is a thing that I call owneritis. And it's the inability to look at your own animals and see how they are positioned relative to other people's animals, because you have emotion involved that's blinding. And it's, I've noticed over the years, of course, we all do it with our own kids. We think they're greater than perhaps other people think our kids are. And we do the same thing with our livestock. And unless you can fight it off, it's really debilitating to make advances in your own herd, because you really don't realize what you need to do to improve your own herd. I learned that when I was fairly young. I remember clearly showing a bull in Denver for some breeders in Canada, and it was co-owned also by people in the U.S. The people wanted me to show this bull because the judge was a friend of mine, and I kept telling them that would not help them in the least. Long story short, the bull stood second, and there was a lull between classes, and one of the owners of the bull mentioned to the judge from a distance that the bull that won that last class was a no-good counterfeit SOB. And the judge said, without stopping and hesitating, he said, "You are right. Just think of what the bull in second must have looked like."
Just gave it right back. That's good.
So every time when I showed cattle and I stood lower than I thought I should, I always remembered that. Said, well, if I think that this one in front of me when we're leaving the ring that's placed higher than me is not very good, mine couldn't have looked very good either.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that always kept me grounded and said, well, then I've got to make improvements. So as I said, I think owneritis to this day is the biggest obstacle that people have to get over in order to improve their own herd.
Mm-hmm. I love the competition of showing, but I will admit sometimes I get too drawn into it where I'm solely focused on playing as solely focused on the placings as compared to the presentation and the marketing opportunity.
Well, I think you wouldn't be alone there. But if you don't have that passion to get drawn into it, you're really not going to get anything out of it either.
Mm-hmm.
But it's that passion of getting that draws you in that sometimes makes you not very objective at the same time. And that's, as I said, is part of what I call owneritis, and it's the hardest thing to overcome in breeding cattle,
Mm-hmm.
because you always think yours are the best. And
Did you?
obviously, they're not always the best.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there. Did you find that you had a set of mentors back when you were really getting into it that were teaching you about things like owneritis, or is that something that came to you as an idea more naturally, just some of those people that you had bounced a lot of ideas off of that either gave you some good harsh what do we call it nowadays, constructive criticism, or that really celebrated those achievements with you as much as you appreciated them?
No, definitely. As you're growing up, you develop some mentors, and I had about four of them. One of them that and they all taught me different things in different areas. The one was Wood Donaldson, who owned Lueda Farms at Peterborough, Ontario. That was a farm that had a history of having great shorthorns back in the day, and then they had a great polled Hereford herd after their years with shorthorns. And he was absolutely a master at dealing with people. And he can always make people feel good about their cattle, etc. One of the stories I could tell you about with Wood Donaldson was we were traveling in the U.S. in Indiana, and we stopped to see a client of his that he had sold cattle to, and this fellow was pressing him about what he thought of his bull. And Wood kept giving him answers that were kind of vague. And the guy wasn't having any part of it. And he finally cornered him and said, "No, I want you to tell me really what you think of my bull." And Wood said, "Well, he looks very fertile to me." Well, the guy was very, very happy with this assessment. And we were driving down the highway, and I said to Wood, "Well, what do you mean that bull is very fertile? He was god-awful." Wood said, "I know." But he said, "Dave, every year in our own calf crop, we get some bug-eyed, pot-bellied, horrible-looking bull calf that wants to breed everything on the place, and that's what that bull reminded me of." So he was able to instill some humor in describing it, and he could always do that. It would mean something to him about the people who he was describing their animals to would just love him for it.
Right.
So,
He was being
so
honest, but in a truly nice way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One of the other ones was mentors was Don Mitchell of Klondike Farms. Don wasn't that great a marketer. In fact, because he wasn't a great marketer, he knew that himself, and he would hire somebody else to market his cattle to a large degree. So, but Don was really good with business.
Mm-hmm.
And he taught me more about the concept of cows that he called robbers. And a cow that was a robber for Klondike Farms was one that took away from him the opportunity to do something above the commercial level with their calves. So if a cow produced something that had to go straight to the auction mart, she was a robber because he couldn't add any value for genetic purposes on her calves. So he kept talking about you always want to get rid of the robbers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways that he determined who the robbers were, he would be one of the pioneer guys in performance testing. and he would use that as a big tool to eliminate the robbers out of his herd. So he was quite influential about that, because there really wasn't, even when I was younger, any great amount of money in raising commercial cattle. And if you wanted to make the best return on your investment for the land that you had in the cattle, you needed something where you could have some added value. So the term robbers, a cow being a robber, always stuck out in my head.
Yeah, that's a good one. And looking back on a robber, it's not only that opportunity of value added, it's also the time and effort that you put into her trying to make them good purebred cows.
No, exactly right. A third mentor would have been Louis Latimer, much more on a limited scale of Remitol farms. But the thing I always admired about Louis, he was never afraid to start something new. I think some of that came from, he had a background of selling cars, having a car dealership before the farming that he did. So he'd always tell me, look, if people want a Chevrolet, then you sell them Chevrolets, because that's going to be a much easier way for you to make a living than trying to sell them a type of car or breed of car, if you want to call it that they don't really like, because your market's going to be much, much bigger.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that I always kept in mind, because it led me to move on from Polled Herefords at some point in our career into the Red Angus world.
Mm-hmm.
It was, again, when we started adding a few Red Angus to the herd, we did it very quietly. Not very many people knew, and yet I would still get the odd call in the first year or two for a Red Angus bull. And I kept thinking to myself, well, if that's what they want, and I haven't really marketed them at all, then that's maybe what we better start raising.
Right. Was Barney still involved at that time too?
No, Barney and I were involved in one venture, and that was it.
Okay.
So that was about 1973, 74.
Mm-hmm.
Lasted about a year and a half, where we bought a bunch of half-blood blonde Aquitaine cattle in Alberta.
Mm-hmm.
Took them they were heifer calves. We took them to Ontario and bred them, calved most of them out, and then sold 3 quarter-blood blondes in the sales. And once that group of cattle were gone, Barney returned to his raising chickens and milking dairy cows.
Okay.
That's where he came from.
Well, that's neat.
Yeah, so fourth mentor, still friend to this day, would have been Glenn Klippenstein.
Mm-hmm.
And I really met him through Don Mitchell of Klondike Farms, because that's who Don basically got to market his cattle. So Don would always ship, in some arrangement, to Glenkirk Farms any cattle that they basically needed to sell over the years. Klippenstein, to this day, one of the most positive, talking and energetic guys that I think that I've ever spent a lot of time with. So, basically I learned, and still to this day learn from him, to be positive and be upbeat. It becomes part of your natural psyche as you spend time doing that. He doesn't spend time with people that are down, because he says he'll drag you down with them. So that process between those 4 mentors and taking from each of them really helped us along the way in terms of having successful production sales. And it also helped in somewhat to a degree in the selection process for bringing outside genetics into the herd, etc.
Yeah, when mentors usually are offering some advice in those situations where you're growing or looking for something different, it can always be valuable and You know, just like when you got that call for the Red Angus bull, you know, that's also another sign. So I think that's kind of neat.
Yeah. I can't remember which of the four mentors, or if it was one of the four, that where I learned one thing that was totally invaluable.
Mm-hmm.
One of them told me that when people came to them for advice, that they were absolutely willing to share and give them the best possible advice, but when it stopped was when the person who's seeking the advice started telling them how good this animal was or the other one was, or how to feed something or breed something. As soon as they started giving advice back, the mentorship stopped.
Right.
And I thought that was quite fascinating. And then I found myself over the years doing the same thing. When your student starts telling you how to do stuff, you no longer share anymore. So I learned pretty quick never ever to do that.
And that's something that with people I consider mentors that I definitely take to heart. As you say that, that hits me pretty hard, and having a flashback to a phone conversation about this or that, and you're talking about when mentorship stops or slows down, that is bang on. That is absolutely bang on.
Yeah, I don't know why, Kurtis, it's make me think of where you're talking about marketing and developing a herd. Probably I just did it without thinking, but the one thing that I did do that people are amazed at this story, and to me, I thought, well, it's what you do. Years and years ago, we had showed at the Royal Winter Fair. I didn't take polled Herefords to Agribition that year because I was judging the polled Herefords at Agribition. An acquaintance of mine from England was at Agribition. His name was Derek Vaughan, one of the better breeders in England at the time. This would have been 1981, 82. Anyway, he was clearly on a mission in Canada to find his next herd sire. And he had been out in the country looking at a number of bulls. He attended Agribition. I met him there, was talking to him, and I said to him, you know, we had a bull calf on a 2-year-old that we had showed at the Royal Winter Fair. Obviously, I couldn't bring him to Agribition because I was judging, that I thought might be a fit for him. Derek told me that he couldn't take time to come out to our place and see the bull because he only had an hour layover from Regina in Toronto before he flew on to London, England. So I found out what flight he was on. I loaded up the bull calf in a little livestock trailer and took the bull to the airport in Toronto.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I went around and around in this parking lot, you know, multi-story parking lot, to find a spot where I could park this truck and trailer.
Yeah.
I went and met his flight, took him out to the parking lot, let him look at the bull in the trailer, and then he flew back to London. I sold him the bull. The bull became show bull of the year for 3 years in a row in England. His name was Goldbar Profile.
Huh.
And then he became sire of the year in England for 8 years in a row.
For 8 years in a row.
The interesting part,
Oh,
yes, the interesting part was that where I was going with this, England was still, as far as the world was concerned for breeding Herefords, was still the number one source. It was the focal point of Herefords. Very few countries had the ability to export cattle because they didn't have health papers. Long story short, England did, and countries around the world would go to England to buy Hereford bulls, and females for that matter. At the same time that this bull was doing so well for Derek Vaughan and us secondarily, a number of countries came up with health protocols that let them come to Canada. And they came to Gold Bar and said, well, we might as well go right to the source as anywhere else. So it opened up exports in Denmark to us, exports to Australia, and we sold semen to countries in Africa that people that I'd never heard of said, well, we saw your genetics in England. So that one act of taking the bull to Toronto to show him, because he couldn't come see the bull, was one of the best things that we ever did in terms of promoting the Gold Bar herd.
Yeah, going above and beyond to market your genetics, right? That is such a great story, because it, to me, also amplifies the drive and belief that you had in your herd and your product at the time. And you also knew this fellow well enough to know, I think I have the right type. You weren't just trying to sell him one you had, if you get what I mean by that.
No, I do get what you mean. And yeah, I had never been to England before, but one of the reasons that this bull was, in a sense, more of a fit for him than for us, he had a spot of white hair on his back, which was a mismarking for coloring in terms of marketing him in North America. That wasn't a mismarking at all in the UK.
Right.
And to my knowledge, the bull never actually had a mismarked calf.
Really?
But it limited his ability for sales in Canada, but not the rest of the world, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But, having said that, one of the things that we did differently than most people, I traveled extensively to see other herds. So if somebody called and needed some guidance on what we had in our sale that might be good for them, I was able to speak with greater clarity, knowing what was important to them, number one, and two, what I thought would also improve their herd, because I had seen their herd. And that probably was a thing that helped me more selling cattle across Canada and the USA than any other thing that I did. It was a difficult thing to keep doing because it sucked up a bunch of time. It wasn't cheap. It was hard on the family that you left behind because you were gone so much.
Mm-hmm.
But it developed some other skills in us at the same time. My dad helped raise my kids, put a tremendous stress on my wife because I was always gone. But we also developed the ability to develop herdsmen.
Right.
And it was kind of pleasing in a way to see these men and women grow up, become valuable to others. I always said about the time I got a herdsman to the level of experience that I really, really like, they were so valuable to somebody else that they got hired away.
Hired away, yeah.
Yeah. And I was thinking of some of those people. Kevin Brown would be one who's now managed for several years in the Dobby Highlands herd.
Yeah.
Phil Brown, his brother, who's the manager of Coppertone.
Copper Creek, yep.
And my cousin Rob, who now owns his own Angus operation.
Mm-hmm.
Heather Mackenzie Ryby, who is a Port Hereford breeder and a veterinarian.
Mm-hmm.
Jocelyn Jansen Burt, who became a veterinarian. And Helen Rowe from Australia, who was with us about 5 years, that went back to Australia and started her own fitting service. So it was nice to be part of helping them develop to go on and do really well themselves in life.
Yeah. And when you time, a lot of the emphasis I put on this podcast is that mentorship side. And right there, that's a list of people that, you had such a large effect on their life and where they went from there. A lot of great experiences, some probably not, but all learning and developing to the end goal.
Yeah, in their own rights, each of them were great people, and it was, as I said, certainly pleasing to see them go on and do really well themselves. As much as it hurt when they left,
mm-hmm.
As I said, when they got hired away, and you started out with another one.
Yep.
For example.
So, did your kids start showing Herefords, or were your kids more into showing the Red Angus cattle?
No, the kids started out showing Herefords.
Mm-hmm.
And a great breed for them to start with, because they're super disposition cattle. They started through 4-H, and our girls were at the age when the Canadian Junior Hereford Association started. That they were just at the age where they got heavily involved with that as well.
Mm-hmm.
They had various positions in the provincial association, then in the Canadian Association. And our second girl, Sarah, was a co-chair of Bonanza one year.
Mm-hmm.
So they had a great thing to develop their skill set in organization and dealing with people, etc. For the Junior Association, having had their summer show Bonanza each year, that became our family summer holiday. And regardless of where it was, we went to it. And other than in BC, we took cattle to it each year. We just didn't take them to BC because the distance was just too daunting
Yeah.
at the time of the year when it was so hot to be moving cattle too.
Well, you
Yeah,
just
they were
described
all
my
involved in
family's
the
summer
business.
holidays too. We got involved with the CJHA, and my father was our adult advisor for several years, and myself and younger sister, we were on the executives within the provincial side and the national side. And my older brother, he wasn't quite as interested in showing, but we would travel around, and the shows he did come to before he started working in the summers, him and my mom would go do some other stuff, and lots of times go hit a golf course. So that was our family summer trips too, was following the National Junior Hereford Show in Canada too.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know what year this year's Bonanza is, but I can remember the first one because I judged it. It was in Alberta. I don't remember exactly which time. I think Old.
Red Deer,
Not
was it
certain anymore.
Red Deer or Old? My father was there. My father was at the very first Bonanza.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember judging it. Remember a young lady who had the champion female with a horned Hereford female. Her name was Lynn, I want to say last name Catley, who is now Lynn Longshore
Mm-hmm.
at Boreal Angus. So again, an example of how this junior youth organization in itself develops people to go on and do really well in life themselves.
Oh, that's without a doubt. So you'd mentioned your girls there. Do you mind just introducing them quick and just they're around in the industries, I believe?
Yeah, one of them's still totally involved in the industry. The other three are not.
No, okay.
Our oldest girl, Carrie Hasson, is actually in graphic arts and advertising business. She now works for a mortgage firm and lives in Aurora, Ontario, just on the north side of Toronto. Sarah Hasson Buchanan has a business of photographing, videoing bulls and marketing purebred livestock, not just bulls, I should say, on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
The company is called Golden Thread Livestock.
Mm-hmm.
And she and her husband, Brad, near Caron, Saskatchewan, have an Angus herd and a Charolais herd. Our third daughter, Susie, she is the manager of a hair salon in Guelph. Our fourth daughter, Dawn, is a personal support worker working at an old age retirement home in Guelph. I keep telling her that she's the one that has to look after me someday. So that's what the four of them are doing. They all have an interest in agriculture, but Sarah is the only one that's actually involved in agriculture at the moment.
Okay. No, it's neat. I've actually been fortunate enough to judge your granddaughters out here in Saskatchewan at a couple different shows and enjoy watching their passion and drive for showing those cattle and doing the best that they can. It's something that someone that evaluates cattle can appreciate. And I know you understand that feeling too.
Yeah, I've always said that the agriculture in general, but livestock in particular, because of their daily needs, really are a wonderful thing to get kids involved with, because it keeps them busy, it gives them a routine, and it keeps them more on the straight and narrow.
Mm-hmm.
I find very many kids in agriculture that have difficulties with some of the other things that kids in the cities have to deal with. In particular, I'm thinking more back in when our kids were growing up, drugs were becoming a thing that were more on the scene. And agriculture, because of its demands on your time, and livestock because of its demands on your time specifically for each times of days to be fed, etc., have a tendency to keep kids really busy and focused on other things, and it helps them get through that period of adolescence where they're more equipped to make decisions on their own as they age.
Yes,
So
understanding.
Really, really helpful.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there again. Bad habit is as we're in this two people that like to visit with one another.
No, exactly. I don't know. The only other thing I could think of, Kurtis, to share with you is I always said that agriculture is a highly capital-intensive business with pretty low margins. So you have to do it for other reasons than making a lot of money or cash along the way. It's a fascinating business that way. It's interesting because the reason I bring this up, because when my dad was about 65-ish, he wanted to retire. I'd say that's the first time he wanted to retire, because he never ever did retire, so to speak, but he kept stepping back, I guess would be the words I could use. And about that time, I wanted to spend less time on the road. So someone who travels a lot, if you ask them where they want to go next, they'd say home.
It is home.
And I was kind of, I was more in that mode. But then, so I was looking for a business that required little capital to start and that had wider margins. And where I got some of those ideas from was from some of the people that we would hire to help us with marketing over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And auctioneers were the best example I could think of. The auctioneers really had no capital invested. They might have a little capital invested in a PA system, but basically no capital invested. And they made a nice living if they were good at their trade.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the kind of business that I wanted to start. Long story short, because of the capital intensiveness of the farm and working alongside my mom with the bookkeeping, etc., I realized that there had to be something that was a little bit easier to do. So I got more and more interested in financial services.
Mm-hmm.
Long story short, in '89, we sold our Old Hereford herd. My dad wanted to step back. I sold one of the farms that I lived on to become a golf course, actually. And I started a mutual fund dealership and a personal insurance dealership.
Oh, that's interesting. Going from the heart of agriculture into, a related business, but something that is more office, the financial sector, just a very rapid change of pace.
Yeah, it fit at the time because at the exact same time we started adding Red Angus en masse, you might call it, to the herd, and I found it to be a great breed for absentee management. Because my dad wasn't as involved anymore. I was obviously off the farm with the financial services business. So these things had to do it even more on their own than even we did with our polled Herefords.
Mm-hmm.
And that breed is quite good at looking after themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So we built the financial services business. We called it was Hasson Twist Financial. I started with a friend, Charlie Twist. Anyway, we had the mutual fund dealership and the insurance dealership. And we started that in 89, sold it in 2000, because at that time there was a lot of amalgamation in financial services, and we had to be big to justify the electronic systems you needed to properly report to clients, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
So we sold it in 2000 to Investment Planning Council of Canada. And I basically managed a branch for them until I retired last September. It was an interesting business. When we sold it, we actually had 13 branches in southwestern Saskatchewan and 69 salespeople in the field.
And that was from 89 to 2000. You had grown that much?
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then the Investment Planning Council actually had, I want to say, 580 some people in the field at the end of all the kind of mergers and acquisitions that they made along the way. So I was lucky enough in the financial services business to become Financial Planner of the Year for Canada in 2 different years.
Cool.
Which I felt really, really good about, because it's all about a business of helping others, and getting recognized by your peers was pretty cool.
Yes, that for sure is. And it sounds like the drive to build up and develop your cattle herd never took a back seat when you transferred into your financial planning business. That drive and passion for what you do was still there.
Well, it was, and I always call it the fear of starvation is a great motivator.
Mm-hmm.
It was funny because when we hired people to become financial planners for our firm, the ones who made it and did really, really well always had a bit of fear of starvation there. If they had a spouse who was making all kinds of money and they were really looking to do something that just got them out of the house, never ever really did very well. But those who had a fear of hunger always did really, really good.
A little more skin in the game. So just to reel back, the one question I have now, and we got into your financial planning business, and that previous in the interview, you had talked about others going to look at, or you going and consulting for others and looking at cattle, and how you get into the show ring and we're watching people show, and especially our kids, and emotion is blinding. Is that does that still reverberate into financial planning? The emotion of your money can wreck some good decisions.
It can. I think that people struggled more with the emotion of money were the ones who were self-employed. So we would have quite a few clients in agriculture. And it's interesting, when you have a herd of cattle, a land base, etc., you know instinctively that the value of that land and cattle, etc., goes up and down somewhat. You're somewhat comfortable in that the value of land over time will go up, but it's not in your face how much it's gone up or down, because you have a kind of a sense of what it's worth, but you don't really know for sure what it's worth until you go to sell it. When you do sell it in the end and you have this money, and all of a sudden now you're giving control of the money to somebody else, i.e. a financial planner, and every waking moment you know exactly what your money's worth, it stirs up emotion in the self-employed that they're unused to. And really they have a struggle in the investment world.
Mm-hmm.
And It's funny because in the investment world, most things are long-term investments. You know they go up and down, but to know the value of it every waking moment is something that a lot of people just can't handle.
That's something I don't like seeing myself when we talk about the stocks and investing and whatever else. I'm not very good at watching things go up and down.
No, and it's funny because I think instinctively you know your own place is worth less or more each day, but you don't know how much. And you're growing up with it, so you don't really worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
The people who generally make the best investors are the ones who worked for somebody else, recognize they have to set some of their paycheck aside, and they have had many, many years of seeing valuations go up and down.
Mm-hmm.
But people who are self-employed, as you talked about yourself, myself included, that was the biggest struggle I had launching from one to the other, is seeing this daily evaluation. And you always feel really good on the day that it goes up and not so good on the day that it goes down.
Yeah.
And one of my mentors in the investment world always said, if you want to be a great investor, you have to have the ability to do the opposite of what your emotions tell you to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say there's only maybe 1 in 1,000 that can do that.
Yeah. To have the
steel.
To have the steel to outweight things, outweight your emotions, be able to process it. Almost in the third person, you have to be able to process a lot of those emotions, I'd imagine. I've never been there myself, but highly incapable.
You're not alone there.
Mm.
That's quite normal.
Well, I just sure appreciate you coming on and sharing some of those stories. And I've just written down so many different notes here. I appreciate the insight and again that mentorship overall, the advice you give. I hope this is a platform that young people, old people, whatever. I'm 32 and I just want to learn more every day. And the biggest thing I've learned out of this, just going back to when, that mentorship halts and you start giving that advice back. And at 32 today, maybe I think I am slightly too smart and I need to go back and adjust on re-listening to mentors as compared to offering my own advice again.
It was a pleasure to talk to you, Kurtis, and sorry for the ramble. It's, one gets talking about one thing that leads to another, and before long you realize that you're rambling and going all over the place. So I hope it's something that your listeners can benefit from.
It's something that I truly enjoyed, Dave, very much. I don't think it was rambling at all. I think great stories and insight lead into more stories and insight. And my idea is to have it feel like we're just having a cup of coffee and a visit, or just that opportunity of speaking and having a free-flowing conversation, not being very caught up in being a very strict segment by segment type interview.
Good stuff.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you again. Sure appreciate it. And now that you're out in Calgary, Alberta, I hope you're enjoying some sunshine, have a few showers out there. And if you're working on the golf game, I imagine, I'm not much of a golfer myself, but all the best and marking those negative scores down.
Well, thank you. Actually, one of my best friends has now bested me by one in the hole-in-one contest that we have. He has 9 holes in one, and I have 8, so I've got to work harder to catch up to him.
Yeah, to me, that just sounds like the perfect reason to double your golf game scheduling for the upcoming foreseeable future.
Could you send me, please, the clipping of that recording so I can play that to my wife?
You know what? Sometimes we need to stick together because a happy wife is a happy life at the same time, right?
Exactly.
No, again, thank you so much for coming on. And I just know our listeners are going to appreciate everything you've shared with us as much as I have.
Great pleasure.
All the best. We'll talk to you soon. Well, everyone, Thanks again for tuning in to the Livestock Podcast. Heartfelt thank you to David Hasson, Gold Bar Livestock, for sharing those stories and insight. Him and I had talked off air a couple times leading up to this episode, and I just was blown away by the couple of those stories. He kept them on the back burner from me. I didn't even have any prep. That's the ultimate in marketing, taking a bull to the airport so a fella can look at him and then he turns into a breed legend. The story of Gold Bar Profile, which Profile is kind of a fitting name for that too. Please feel free to find us on all the social media channels at Lifestock Pod. If you're enjoying our podcasts and interviews, please feel free to pass it along to some of your friends. Hey, have you listened to this? You can find it on iTunes, Spotify, any of your favorite podcatchers. If anyone out there in our listening community is interested in becoming involved or maybe sponsoring a segment, you can have the Go and Show and segment sponsored currently by the Cliffs Farm if you'd like to. But really, again, I just wanted to remind everyone that it's a good thing to want to better yourself and chase your passions. Ask questions. Don't be afraid of hard work. Get on the road when possible and make some in-person visits. Those will be the best learning experiences and memories of all. In these last few interviews, their talk has been traveling and people, and this is a people business. I think far too often we forget about the golden rule of treating others the way you want to be treated, no matter what we're doing. And I think that just echoes back on these last two. So again, thank you for listening, and we'll be talking to you soon.